All right, joining me is Bob Werb, chairman of the Space Frontier Foundation. I have so many questions for you, Bob. Thanks for talking to us.
Happy to do it.
I'm a bit of a space travel. I don't know that I would call myself a junkie, but I've read plenty of science fiction, and I probably have a lot of false ideas about what's possible and what's not. So I'll just get right into it. What's reasonable to expect in the next 5 to 10 years instead of space exploration and space travel?
Well, I actually want to answer a slightly different question, which is take a little bit longer term.
Okay.
Because the next 5 to 10 years are spectacularly muddled. And because there's just so much going on right now. And I think if we step back a little bit and look at, say, 20 years, we can have a lot more clarity in terms of understanding what's going on today. Because until just about 20 years ago from where we are now, human spaceflight was almost entirely about sending a few brave souls on military-style missions, these grand adventures of exploration. And the rest of us were supposed to stay home and watch on TV. And that began to change. And while I know that there are more than a few people who would like to go back to, relive the glory days of Apollo, that is simply not possible. I could spend an hour going over the numerous reasons why it just ain't going to happen. But for the moment, just take my word for it. There's no going back.
So what is the way forward in your, is it planets? Is it just getting is it a colony on the moon? Is it a permanent, something permanent on a bigger space station?
Well, I think it's all of the above. And we need to really ask first, why is it we're doing it? And in my view, if America is going to have any human spaceflight at all 20 years from now, it's going to be almost entirely about using space for the benefit of everyone, rather than for grand adventures of exploration. And by that I mean we're going to open the space frontier in order to protect Earth's fragile environment. We're going to do it to protect human freedom and dignity. And we're going to do it to create prosperity. And in my view, if we don't do it for those reasons, we're just not going to do it at all. And right now, we are right at the middle of this transition, at the fork in the road. And these two very different goals are in really direct conflict. And you see a lot of that conflict in the public discussion about space.
Well, we recently heard about further decreased funding for NASA. So it seems increasingly governments are less and less interested, would it be fair to say, in being involved in space exploration? Does that put the onus on private industry?
I think it's not that government is less interested, but that they're looking to get more value for the money. That they are not willing to fund these grand adventures, but they are willing to fund when they see real value for people here on Earth. And I think if we go out 20 years, when we look back, we'll say, oh, now it makes perfectly good sense. Because we're either going to have safe, reliable, affordable access to space, or we're going to have to go overseas to get into to get into orbit. 20 years from now, we're either going to have a vibrant new space economy that creates large numbers of new jobs, or we will have already lost today's existing government-funded jobs, and we'll replace them with unemployment checks. And in short, I really think that we're either going to be opening the space frontier, or we are going to be watching it happen in other countries while reminiscing about our past glories.
Do you expect the same time?
We make this decision now. We need to choose which way we want to go.
Do you expect the same type of this kind of patriotic, our country versus your country competition when it comes to space exploration going forward? It sounds like you don't think we've moved past that at all.
I think that many of us haven't moved past that. I certainly have. I see space more about economic development than about, showing off how good you are. And I think most people have moved past that point. I mean, not most people in Congress, but most people in the real world.
And what is the most exciting thing specifically that's on the horizon to you right now? I mean, that maybe most people don't even know about who are watching or listening to this. What has the most promise or you get the most excited about?
I think the most exciting thing is actually also the most important thing, which is getting into space affordably, reliably, and safely. Um, you know, you look back at the space shuttle, which is about to fly its last mission, and that thing costs billions of dollars every time you fly it, and there's roughly a 2% chance that you're going to kill everybody on board. Well, this might be appropriate for your grand adventures, you know, in the military style missions that we've been doing up till now. It's clearly not appropriate for any kind of sustainable economic development of the solar system. And we are now developing new vehicles to go into space along two completely different tracks. On the one hand, there are people using old technology. These would be companies like SpaceX and Orbital that are using, 40 and 50-year-old technology to build new rockets that do the same thing as our old rockets, but do them much more cheaply and more reliably. And at the same time, there's a group of people who are building suborbital rocket planes, basically pursuing the path we didn't pursue after the X-15, just to keep building airplanes that go higher and faster until you're all the way in orbit. And both of these are happening in parallel, and both of them offer enormous promise to let us get into space much cheaper and more reliably.
The suborbital flight possibilities. Talk a little bit about specifically what that could mean potentially for consumer airline travel. Is this a potential game changer? I mean, put some numbers behind it. What are we talking about here?
Oh, I mean, clearly flying suborbital intercontinental flight is the killer app. A lot more people want to go to the other side of the planet than want to go into space. And anybody who's ever sat on a 14-hour airplane flight would realize that if they could afford it, they'd pay almost anything to avoid that experience. But the technology is not quite there yet. The first generation of suborbital vehicles will be flying over the next couple of years, basically fly into space and come back to where they started from. They have very limited downrange capability. And there will probably be 2 more generations before we get to the point where we can actually fly halfway around the planet.
But what are we talking about in terms of speed? I mean, for some people who may not know, potentially we could get around to the other side of the world, and what are we talking? Instead of 14 hours, it might be...
Half hour, 45 minutes.
That's incredible.
It mostly depends on how it is you get to before you actually get into space. You're in space for 15, 20 minutes. And interestingly, once you can get to the other side of the planet, you pretty much can get to orbit. There's very little difference between the mission profile of getting to the other side of the planet and the mission profile of getting into low Earth orbit.
Remarkable. And, I have just so many questions, and we are short on time. The other thing a lot of people emailed me about, and they want for me to ask you is, are there practical applications to a base on the moon, or is that just kind of is it a pointless idea?
Well, we don't really know enough. There may be some things on the moon that are immensely valuable. It's our only known source of helium-3. Now, currently, there's no market for helium-3, but if ever they get fusion reactors to work, they'll need a lot of helium-3, and the moon's the logical place to get it. It's also a possible location for building materials. But the asteroids compete perhaps favorably with going to the moon for building materials. We don't want to build things in space with bricks that we bring up from the Earth. We want to use bricks that we find in space. Just like you only bring, you didn't bring bricks from the old world to the new. We brought the tools to make the bricks.
Makes perfect sense. Well, this is fascinating stuff. Bob Werb, chairman of the Space Frontier Foundation. Thanks for joining us, and we'll definitely have you back. I know our audience will have plenty more questions for you.
I'd love to do it.
Okay, thanks, Bob.